webinar, and really encouraging to see so many people joining us this morning. I'll just give you a brief introduction. My name's Simon Warwick. I'm director of the Lower Ure Conservation Trust. We set the charity up about 25 years ago with a focus on improving the ecology of the area. In doing so, we realized one of the great opportunities was to work with the minerals industry, because to an extent they were working on a landscape scale and offered an opportunity to really start with a blank canvas. So in doing so, I think one of the great things was that we had quite a lot of local knowledge, and the more we looked into it, the more we learned. And as I mentioned in the first webinar, sources like the Reverend Henry Horrocks Slater's Flora of the Ripon District were incredibly enlightening. And really, that gave us a sort of feeling of some of the species we had lost, and the changes where species like bee orchid were described as abundant. So if we knew the species had occurred in the past, there was a scope for doing so again in the future if we got the right conditions. And really, today's talk is very much about the species that we've lost, but actually the reasons why we have lost those species, which I'm afraid probably are largely man-induced. Leading on to Martin's talk, I'll give you a little bit of a brief on Martin as well. I sort of first met up with Martin just over 20 years ago and realized immediately his depth of knowledge and his enthusiasm for the task. And 15 years ago, he drew up the first report on the lost plants of the area, of the Swale and Ure Washlands area, which we'll show a map of on page 2 of the webinar. Now, one of the really crucial things to us was that we wanted to be able to deliver something really special for wildlife, to look at species like bittern. You know, there's no point starting low, aim high. And the other thing that was really at the heart of what we wanted to do was to recognize that actually thinking on that global scale was one thing, but to deliver locally. And that local understanding of what there had been in the past was crucial to understanding what there could be in the future. And as you'll see from Martin's work, the devil is in the detail, as they say, with over 130 species of plants lost. It is that detail of where we have lost them from that is so absolutely crucial to understanding what we could do in the future. And so, in addition to the webinar that we did a couple of weeks ago, which will be going online fairly shortly, and also an update of the report. The report that Martin did 15 years ago, we now have so many more resources available to us, not least of all through the BSBI. And so that has enabled Martin to get a much clearer picture of exactly what's happened. But you will appreciate when you see the report just how much work has gone into it. And Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, with funding from the Environment Agency, have been generous enough to help us to update that report. So I will pass you over fairly shortly, but I've just got one or two things to sort of go through in terms of housekeeping. All your cameras will be switched off and you will be muted until we get into the questions. At the end, Joe will be collating questions, and most of those will be put through to Martin to answer. When we, after that, you will be unmuted and can therefore chip in and ask questions personally. One thing I would say is that right at the beginning, we will be placing a poll. So as I close down, we'll be putting a pole up, and then at the end we'll put another pole up. If you'd be kind enough to fill that in, that helps a lot, because we've been generously funded, as you'll see bottom left, by the Heritage Fund, and it's good for them to get some feedback. Also, please do stay in touch via our website, Facebook and Twitter. So at this point in time, I will hand over, and with a bit of luck, Martin will pop up on the screen fairly shortly. Bye for now.
Sorry, I hope there's a little bit of a hitch there. I hope you can all hear me. Otherwise, I shall spend 40 minutes talking to the computer, and you'll be all none the wiser.
Yes, we can all hear you, Martin. Thanks.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. So good morning. I mean, it's brilliant to have a good, a turnout like this. We thought this might be a relatively small audience for this webinar, but it turns out not to be, which is fantastic that there's that level of interest. So this is the second webinar we're doing about the evidence that we're looking at to inform the way that we try and restore and recreate habitats in the Swale and Ure Washlands. So last week was, sorry, a fortnight ago was looking at the broad brush, the landscape history of the area, and today I'm going to be talking about the lost flora. That's the vascular plants, the flowering plants and ferns of the washlands, and what that tells us about how habitats have changed, how the landscape has changed, what opportunities there might be to restore some of those habitats, and what unfortunately may have gone forever. So just to recap on what is the Swale and Ure Washlands. Well, as Simon mentioned, it was a project area originally kind of like focused on trying to make the most of opportunities for restoring mineral sites, mainly sand and gravel quarries for nature conservation. It's since taken on a sort of like rather broader role. Essentially, this is for the people who aren't local. This is central North Yorkshire up the A1 corridor. So it's it starts downstream roughly where the River Ure becomes the River Ouse upstream of York, and extends up the River Swale to Catterick, and then up the Ure Valley to a point just upstream of Massam. Broadly speaking, this is what people refer to as the Vale of Mowbray, with the magnesian limestone ridge flanking it to the west. So to the northeast of here, you've got the North York Moors, and then to the west, you've got the Yorkshire Dales. So it's the lowland vale between the two upland areas. So we realised that if we wanted to recreate and restore habitats that were true to the local landscape and the history of the area, we needed to understand why things had changed. And really, there's three elements that we've been looking at to that: landscape history, the wider story of how the environment's changed, what the countryside used to look like, and that was the subject of the webinar 2 weeks ago. Lost species, so I'm going to be talking today about plant species, and that gives us the fine grain, the finer detail of how the landscape's changed. And we also look at remnant habitats, the fragments that are left that we can build upon, and we've been quite strongly focused on using the local remnant habitats as a library of genetic material. We've got a large plant propagation project at Nosterfield Quarry that is completely using seeds and cuttings from within the washlands or very close by. So just to recap what we talked about a fortnight ago, if we were to have a time machine and go back to round about 1750, the landscape of central North Yorkshire would be it would have moors, mires, meres, meadows and meanders. So the moors were areas of common land, open areas, grazed communally by villagers, and these amounted, well, between 1750 and 1850, around 5,000 hectares of commons were enclosed. So they were divided up into fields and fenced off and brought into private ownership. That's a big area, isn't it? It's about, I think it's about 50 square kilometres, isn't it? If I've got my maths is correct. I mean, prior to 1750, a lot of other commons were enclosed, so that wasn't, the grand total in the late medieval period would have been much larger. But around about 1750, you still had 5,000 hectares of commons within the washlands, and these would vary according to the soil and geology of the location. So some would be magnesian limestone grassland, some would be heathland, some would be sandy grassland, and so on. We know there were lots of mires or cars. It's a very common place name still in the area. So we've identified over 150 historic wetland sites. Some of these were quite small. They were just dips in the ground that were very hard to drain. Others were quite extensive floodplain grazing marshes. There were also 5 mires. These are natural shallow lakes. So at Snake Mires, there was a very large, at least seasonal mere there before it was drained in the late 1700s. And then there were 4 more smaller lakes around the Cowtons, which is around the headwaters of the River Wiske in the northern Vale of Mowbray. We know there were lots of floodplain hay meadows. This is a feature that has almost completely disappeared from the local landscape. So we think, based on known sites, there were probably around 1,300 hectares of floodplain hay meadows up to the 18th century. These would be very similar to the Ings further down the Ouse. So if any of you know sites like Clifton Ings or Acaster South Ings or Waterfulford Ings, they'd be very similar. They were meadows that were divided up into numerous strips from which individual households could take hay, but then they were open to common grazing after the hay had been harvested in August. So that was a really extensive area of habitat. In fact, there was probably as much species-rich floodplain meadow within the Lower Ure Swale and valleys than there is left in the whole of Britain today, which is a quite striking fact, really. And then meanders, the rivers were not heavily engineered prior to the 18th century. So you had lots of very wiggly rivers with all the complicated habitats and ecological complexity that goes with that. So floodplain wetlands, oxbows, and so on. So just to talk a little bit about how we know what we know about the botanical history of the area. The Swale and Ure valleys have got a particularly rich archive of botanical records. This was something that was quite striking when we started to look into it. And it really gives us a lot of information from which we can start to understand how things have changed. So one of the first botanists that we know of in the area was a chap called Anthony Ascombe, who was vicar at Burniston, and he published a book that was quite widely used at the time in 1550 called A Little Herbal, and he also wrote a textbook on astronomy. His books are very strange to the modern eye. It was this kind of post-Renaissance era where you had almost kind of like a merging of mysticism and science. People were trying to make sense of events. People were trying to understand patterns of cause and effect, but they didn't have a very scientific method. So his books are all about, which herbs you use in different phases of the moon for people with different astrological signs and so on. So all rather strange, but he did have, he clearly had a very detailed understanding of flora of different plants, and it's quite striking that many of the plants you can clearly recognize today, they have the same names in many instances that we use today. He didn't particularly, there's no records as such from the local area but presumably Ascham would have derived some of his knowledge from the plants he would have seen in the fields and lanes around Burniston. A little bit later on, the next important botanist we've got locally is Matthew Dodsworth, who was rector at Sesse in the late 17th century. He seems to have been the first person to have recorded a plant called tufted loosestrife, a lovely plant that's there in the background. Although it was originally published as being in the east of Yorkshire, it's quite likely the site was actually Leckby Carr, which is between Boroughbridge and Dishforth. There's no reason to think that he was sort of like out in Holderness or anywhere. To give you some idea of the timing of this, Dodsworth collected a lot of plant specimens, and some of those are still in the herbarium of the Natural History Museum. And he actually employed the services of a simpler. A simpler was a professional herb collector. This was a chap called Willisell, who was actually a veteran of Cromwell's army. So it gives you some sense of the of timing there. You know, so these are really early records. Into the Georgian period, we start seeing a proliferation of natural history recording in North Yorkshire. And there's people like William Gawthorpe, who was the rector at Ripley. You know, very often these the early recorders were the local clergymen. They presumably had quite a lot of time on their hands, and they also saw it as a vocation to describe and catalogue nature. And so he produced a lot of records. Some of the first records that we got of places like Staveley Cars, the Ripon area, and the wider Harrogate district. A little bit later on, a chap who died quite young in Ripon called William Brunton. I think he was a chemist. He was a prolific naturalist, and he produced hundreds of records of plants. So he gives us a really quite detailed understanding of the flora of the Ripon area in the late 18th century. And some of Brunton's records were still being cited kind of, you know, well over a century later. When you're looking at botanical records, you've always got to be quite careful to try and drill down and say, is this actually an original record? Is this something somebody's seen recently? Or are they just regurgitating an earlier record? A lot of people look to a series of kind of county encyclopedias that were produced in the early 1900s called the Victoria County History. And if you look at the section on flora in there for Yorkshire, it's got all these wonderful records. But when you actually sort of like look at the provenance of those records, some of those were plants that were recorded by Brunton in the 1790s. And this was in a publication dated 1907. So you always have to be careful. Records are not necessarily contemporary with the publication. So if you're trying to sort of like understand the chronology of change, you've got to be quite careful. Another really prolific local naturalist was James Dalton, another reverend, and he was the reverend of Copgrove, and then he moved to Croft-on-Tees. He lived a much longer life and was quite active, I think, into the 1820s. But he produced an awful lot of records from Copgrove. Many of them would be the area that's now called Bishop Monkton Ings, and a lot of his recording there was round about 1790, so we've got, you know, really good species lists for them. He also looked again at Staveley Cars, at Hutton Moor, the Ripon area, and a bit more widely. So he was the first person to record Rannoch Rush, for instance, in Britain, from Leckby Carr in 1787. It didn't get its name. Its name Rannoch Rush, it comes much later. Originally, it would have just been referred to by its Linnaean scientific name. It's called that because it now only survives at Rannoch Moor in Perthshire, but it was a plant that was scattered across lowland bogs in Britain originally and has retreated to the Scottish Highlands because it's the only place where the habitat's left. Into the Victorian era, we start to see a lot of publications about natural history, and particularly about botany in Yorkshire. So Henry Baines produced a flora of Yorkshire in 1840, and there was a supplement produced 14 years later. And that is really useful because it draws together all the information up to that date. We then have a chap called John Gilbert Baker, who was based at Thirsk for a part of his life. Baker went on to become, well, he moved to Surrey to become the assistant keeper of the herbarium at Kew in 1866, and then towards the end of his career, he was the keeper there. So Baker was he was one of the top botanists in late Victorian Britain. Really, he was a leading expert on taxonomy, i.e., the identification and classification of plants and so on. So he's really important for a number of reasons, partly because of his level of expertise. So sometimes when we get old records of plants that are really difficult to identify, you always have to wonder how reliable the naming of those plants has been. But I think with people like Baker, it's fairly unimpeachable. And also because of his status, for a short while, the Thirsk Natural History Society was the kind of like the epicenter of botanical activity in Victorian Britain. And Baker produced a book, the first edition of which was published in 1863. It's called North Yorkshire, Studies of its Botany, Geology, Climate and Physical Geography. And it's a very hefty tome, and it's important because it was an early attempt at an ecological flora. So rather than just cataloguing what had been recorded where, which had very much been the norm up to that point, he wanted to explain the distribution of individual species and why some species grew with others and so on. And so he was trying to set that in understand the environmental factors that influenced where plants grew and where they didn't. We start to get some really good local studies as well in the later Victorian period. Simon mentioned Henry Slater, who was the rector at Sharrow. In fact, he wasn't there for very long, but he produced an awful lot of records for the Ripon area. So we know an awful lot, for instance, about Sharrow Mires, which is quite a small wetland there, but was extraordinarily species rich. And because his lists are very detailed, we can start to get an idea of what the vegetation looked like, which is quite important, because a list of species is one thing, actually sort of like understanding the habitat and what kind of plant community that was is another. But we can start to get a picture of the kind of species-rich reed fen that was growing in Sharrow Mires at that time. Another important local figure was William Foggett. His portrait is there of Thirsk. So he was a contemporary of Baker, and he carried on recording in the Thirsk area after Baker moved to Surrey. He wrote lots of chapters on the botany of different parts of North Yorkshire that went in popular guidebooks. There's a chap called Edmund Bog who churned out not always the most credible local guides. They were kind of, picturesque, sort of like portraits of local villages kind of thing. But he used to get Foggett to write a botany chapter as part of them. So that's quite nice because we have these little sort of pen portraits of different areas. And this is a specimen of greater sundew that Foggett collected from Leckbicar, and he wrote about how on a bright day these fly traps with their fringed leaves tipped with diamond-like drops glistened in the sun. Lots of later recorders. So, I mean, just to mention Catherine Robb, who lived at Catton Hall, and she was very active in the mid 20th century, and a slightly kind of a lot of what she documented was the decline and demise of sites like Leckbicar and Pilmore, which gives us quite a detailed understanding of what happened to those sites and how they changed. And in the case of Leckbicar, completely vanished. And then we get a lot of information from excursions held by the Yorkshire Naturalist Union, running from the late 19th century through to the late 20th century. These are really useful, although you might think of these sort of naturalists going on outings and keeping a record of what they saw as a slightly frivolous pursuit, the write-ups of these excursions give us a lot of information really about the environment at the time, and we can deduce a lot about environmental change from those reports. So what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this webinar is what we know about the plants that have gone extinct in the local area. We've got this good baseline going back to the late 18th century with a few earlier records, and we can look at which plants have become extinct. What I've done to try and establish extinction is I've looked at the database that of the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, and thanks to them for allowing me access to that. And I've tried to establish which plants haven't been recorded since, now in 1990, I've used as the cutoff, except in a few cases. There's one or two instances where there have been later records, but we're fairly confident those species have now gone. So we've lost about 132 vascular plants from the washlands, and 54 of those are plants that are threatened in Great Britain as a whole. So lots of rare species that have disappeared. As well as the species themselves, we can look at what they tell us about the environment, for instance, using things like the Ellenberg scores. So this is a system of scores that attributes, they're called F values, N values, and R values. So they refer to the water level that the plant prefers, the nutrient status of the soil that the plant prefers, and the reaction. So whether it likes acidic or alkaline soils, and they're used. Most of them are kind of like 1 to 10 scales, and plants are scored on those for each of these attributes, and we can make quite a lot of inferences from that. It's quite a useful tool for us. So the first most obvious thing we need to look at is how have these extinctions been distributed according to habitat. So we can see from this pie chart, about a third of them are water-dependent species. So they're species of fens, mires, or they're aquatic plants. So that's a large chunk of the local flora. Well, I guess you'd expect that. You know, we talked about how we've identified 150 historic wetland sites. I mean, very few of those are still extant. Another large chunk, in fact, the largest single group of locally extinct plants by habitat has been arable plants associated with cornfields, with cultivated land. And then there are lots of smaller groups. Another important one, plants of open, mainly sandy habitats that I'll talk about in a bit more detail later, and so on. So habitats that perhaps we get very concerned about, like woodland, haven't been the focus of a lot of plant losses. This may be because there wasn't much woodland within the washlands in historic times, but we'll go through each group of plants in turn, and I'll try and provide some suggestions about what these losses tell us. So fens and mires, 23 species. So this is the second biggest single group of plants. I would say, grouping these plants by habitat is not a perfect kind of science. There's always there are some species that could fit in any one of 2 or 3 categories. What I have tried to do is go back to the original records and find out where the plants were actually growing in the local landscape, rather than just assuming. So most of these plants grew in very wet, base poor places. So when I say base poor, this means sort of like low in minerals like calcium and magnesium. So these were generally very acid habitats, very, very nutrient poor wetlands. And these were mainly plants that grew on lowland raised bogs. So places like Leckby Carr, Martin Moor Carr, there's also Tanfield Hall Carr. And just to the south of our study area, you had Cranberry Carr at Hunsingaw, and then just to the north near Croft-on-Tees, you had Halnaby Carr. So this is a very rare, incredibly rare habitat now, but wasn't historically. Raised mires develop where you have a small lake, often in a basin or a narrow valley that would have been formed at the end of the last ice age. Plant remains accumulate within the basin, in the form of peat. And eventually that peat, over many, many centuries, builds up to a level where it's above the water table. So it's no longer influenced by the local groundwater. And you start to get acidic conditions developing on the peat surface because it's fed mainly by rainwater, and it often becomes dominated by sphagnum mosses. And then you get a suite of bog plants that are associated with those. You know, you would have to, well, there are probably one or two sites at sort of like intermediate elevations in Yorkshire where you can still see raised mire, but in the lowland plains there is probably nothing left intact. There are large areas of degraded raised mire on the Humberhead peatlands, and at one time they shared many of the plants with these smaller mires in North Yorkshire, but virtually all the Humberhead peatlands have been extensively mined for peat, so they're now in a regenerating state. These were plants that had like acidic conditions, so the R value is low, and very, very low nutrient conditions. The N value is very low there. Now, we talk a lot about recreating habitats and reintroducing things and restoring habitats and so on, but when we look at things like lowland raised bog, you know, effectively it's the product of environmental processes over thousands of years, and it's simply unrecreatable. There is nothing that you could do to recreate that habitat, really, and not within a realistic timescale in the North Yorkshire lowlands. So as much as we get excited about reintroductions and so on, the absolutely critical thing in conservation is to stop these habitats from disappearing in the first place. So this is the list of plants of bogs and poor fens. When we refer to poor fens, we're referring to the base status. So these are fens that are low in mineral salts. This will be, you know, the publication will be online on the website at some point, and this webinar will be, you know, hopefully go up on YouTube at some stage. So I'm not going to go through all the individual lists of species. Rich fens, so fens that were on more mineral-rich substrates. There were 6 plants there. Again, plants of high water levels, generally intermediate pH, and low in nutrients, but not quite as low as the first group. So these were sites like Sharrow Mires, Ainderby Cars, and Newsham and Newby Wisk Cars. And these are plants that we might, you know, associate with things like the fens of Norfolk and so on nowadays. So things like cowbane and marsh fern and lesser tussock sedge. One specialist type of wetland that was surprisingly widespread was seepage fens. So this is where you have springs or seepages where groundwater is sort of like comes to the surface and is trickling across or through the soil. So seepy places. These were low in nutrients but high in pH. So these are sites that are fed generally by groundwater from the limestone, or in the Ure Valley sometimes from gypsum deposits. Now, we haven't actually lost all the plants of this particular type of wetland, but several species only survive at 1 or 2 sites. So there's a site of special scientific interest near Azerley called Cow Mires, and that's right on the edge of our study area, and some of these species only survive there. And when we look at wetland plants, if you look at the number of species that are at risk, you know, you could add another dozen species at least to the 23 that have disappeared, and that's quite important. So, for example, bird's eye primrose that we've got here in the background, that used to grow at over 20 sites in the Washland, and it now survives only at Cow Mires. So this was a really widespread plant. And what's striking is some of these sites weren't in very obvious places. They were probably lots of small marshes that may just have been on spring lines, on ridges of glacial moraine and so on. So bird's eye primrose, you know, grew around Thirsk and around Topcliffe and in areas where we wouldn't naturally expect it. We think of it as a plant of the sort of like dales and the hill country, the hills on the edge of the North York moors and so on now. But In fact, it occurred right across this lowland vale as well. So plants actually grow in water itself, another big group, 20 plants. Some of those have been lost quite recently. So things like fen pondweed and so on. The one site that we knew of for fen pondweed has disappeared within the past 15 years, actually. That was because of a change in management of a trout pond. The majority of these aquatic plants are associated with very low nutrient waters with quite low pH values. So these again were plants that grew on kind of like acidic, peaty sites. Many of them were plants that were only ever recorded from Pillmore, or sometimes, you know, one or two other places. Some of these plants are you know, very rare in Britain now. Water germander is a really striking example. It grew at Bolton on Swale, and very well known there. Lots and lots of botanists travelled to collect specimens from there, which probably didn't do it any good. But it was actually the only site it was ever known in northern England. That's long since gone now. So we've got 7 species of richer waters. Some of these were really widespread, like frogbit, you can see there in the background. That was a relatively frequent plant in the Washlands, you know, 100 or 150 years ago. At least 8 locations, but some of those are quite vague. It probably grew in a lot more places. So really important sites for aquatic plants were Staveley Cars, Newsham and Newby Whiskars, Ainderby Bottoms, and Pillmore. So in the river valleys, particularly along the Wisk, actually, you had quite large areas of grazing marsh that were intersected by ditches. The kind of habitat, again, that, you know, you might see more in the fens or in East Anglia nowadays, but that habitat did exist on river floodplains in central North Yorkshire, and has now very largely gone. There are 1 or 2 ditches that still have plants like water violet and so on that would have gone with these locally extinct species. I won't go into much detail about that. This was just you can identify plants, plant communities that are described in the National Vegetation Classification from some of these records. This is quite technical. I mean, if anybody wants to talk about that later in the questions, we can discuss that, and it'll be in the publication, but it'll probably be a bit of a digression to explain all that at the moment. Okay, so the next group of plants, cornfield flowers, arable flowers. So this is the largest individual category, 24 species. I said at least 24 species because there are actually another dozen arable plants recorded from the Washlands, but often there were only 1 or 2 records. And these seem to have been plants that were just introduced as seed contaminants. So they were there fairly casually. There were a few plants recorded for 1 or 2 years, and then they were never seen again. So I've kind of just understand which plants were an established part of the local flora. So we basically got 24 of those. These are annual plants, as you'd expect from a habitat that's cultivated annually, generally associated with light, sandy or calcareous soils. Although they're plants that like moderately fertile conditions, as you might expect, they're probably plants that are associated with less nutrient-rich soils than you'd expect today. So the N value, again, the nutrient value of the lost species is about 4.3. If you look at modern sort of like cornfield weed assemblages, you'd have something more like sort of like 6, 7 or 8. Lots of these plants that have disappeared from local cornfields are now either extinct or endangered in Britain as a whole. So plants like corncockle, corn cleavers, greater yellow rattle, which we have a very early record of, shepherd's needle, furrow wax, and so on. These were quite familiar plants to those early botanists like Brompton and Dalton. They talked about darnel as being far too abundant in cornfields around Copgrove and Ripon in the around about 1800. Darnel's a grass weed, and it often gets infected with fungi, So if that gets incorporated into the grain, it's quite poisonous. So it was a real nuisance weed for farmers at the time. So here's the list. It's quite a long one. I've included in this, so some of these plants grow in other habitats nowadays. Red hemp nettle, you wouldn't necessarily think of as an arable plant. Now it tends to grow in kind of like chalk scree and old quarries and so on. But it was definitely, it was a familiar plant of stony arable fields in the 19th century. There's a couple of plants, a couple of oddities here. Common broom rape and common dodder that were parasitic plants of clover lays in the 19th century. They were recorded quite commonly. Foggett made a remark about the amount of dodder that sometimes came up in clover lays, actually sort of made it difficult to harrow them because it would snarl up the equipment. There's another group of quite similar plants associated with disturbed ground that have disappeared as well. I've called this sort of like open habitats, really, for want of a better word. And this does highlight a bit of a problem, I think, with nature conservation in Britain, in that if something doesn't have a label, if something isn't named, we don't really care about it. It doesn't appear on any lists. It doesn't become a priority for anyone. And this is definitely the case with this group of plants. So some of these did grow in cornfields, but generally speaking, they're plants that are described as growing on the edges of fields and on waysides, on trackways that went through commons, sometimes described as plants on sandy hedge banks and so on. Generally, again, these were associated with sandy or calcareous soils. Now, the main difference with arable weeds is this group does include some, they're generally small plants, and it does include some biennial and short-lived perennial species. They are all, in this group, they're all native or probably native plants, whereas the vast majority of arable plants are ancient introductions, what we refer to as archaeophytes. So most of our arable flora, even things like poppies and so on, were originally sort of introduced from the Mediterranean and the Near East by Neolithic or Iron Age farmers. Contrastingly, these plants of open sandy habitats are predominantly native species. So really part of the indigenous vegetation, but we don't tend to sort of take much account of them. So we've got 19 species there that have been lost. Generally, these are from sort of like relatively base-rich soils, but some of them like acidic conditions. And a key thing here is they're all associated with low nutrient status. So any sort of like botanists among you will be familiar with some of these plants, and they do form a very distinct group. So this tells us something about habitats that have been lost. Those kind of like scuffed, slightly disturbed sandy habitats on these extensive commons and places like Pilmore and Hutton Moor and so on would have been one habitat. Just lots of kind of like areas with short patchy vegetation, patches of bare sand and so on, along track sides and along the verges of rural lanes and so on. And that habitat has very largely disappeared. I think what's interesting here is that lots of invertebrates, lots of specialized invertebrates also need that habitat. They like patchy vegetation with lots of nectar sources, but also lots of bare ground to bask on and so on. So things like solitary bees, lots of ground beetles, weevils and so on would be associated with the same habitat. So if we've lost this number of plants, we've probably lost an awful lot more invertebrates from the same kind of areas. Another habitat associated with the edges of places, I've called it boundary habitats. Really, this was quite an unsatisfactory grouping of plants, but it was the best I could come up with. In reality, it's sort of like lumping plants with rather different requirements together, but best I could do. So this is 14 species, and again, they're generally plants of hedge banks and verges, or places where you get a mixture of grassland and scrub. I'll mention that a little bit more. And the plants are quite variable conditions. So unlike the last group, they're often plants that like quite fertile, some of them are plants that like quite fertile ground. And some of these are an interesting group of archaeophytes, so ancient introductions. But rather than being cornfield plants, these are perennials that were grown in cottage gardens as herbal plants or as dye plants. So things like catmint, white horehound, dwarf elder that's illustrated here. And they escaped from cottage gardens onto kind of like country lanes, and they were quite, you know, they were a well-known, well-recognised part of the local flora for an awfully long time. But they seem to just start disappearing at the during the 20th century. The interesting thing about this is nobody cares about these plants. I mean, they were part of human history for a long time, but they never seem to have sort of invoked the kind of concern that you get. For instance, you know, there's lots of work done on disappearing arable plants, but you have another group of these archaeophytes that nobody seems to care about. I'm a bit curious about why. It seems to be quite inconsistent approach to plant conservation. A quite different group of plants are plants that are associated with kind of like rocky scrub habitats on limestone. So again, it's another habitat we don't really have a word for. In continental Europe, the German word saum is used, S-A-U-M, and this is the kind of the interface between grassland and scrub, the transitional zone. Often these are plants that don't grow out in open meadows or pastures because they don't like being regularly grazed. On the other hand, they don't like closed woodland either. So there's a distinct little group, you know, 3 species, dark red helleborine, that's illustrated here, fly orchid and bird's foot sedge. And they're all plants of these kind of rocky limestone transitional habitats. The small teasel as well, you could probably put in the same group. So looking at meadows and pastures now, we've got 14 species. You know, we know that we've lost huge areas of species-rich grassland, both, you know, neutral grasslands on clay and loam soils and limestone grasslands on calcareous soils. So of these 14 species, 6 are associated with magnesian limestone grassland. So things like passiflower here that Kevin kindly provided the photo for, that's in the background. We have no sort of like realistic idea of the extent of limestone grassland in the Swale and Ure Washlands, which is a shame because we can't understand how much we've lost. But there must have been a great deal. You know, if you look at the geology, areas of, you know, big open areas of pasture like Thornton Wattless Moor, for instance, you know, must have been limestone grassland. But the magnesian limestone soils, they make good arable land. It tends to be sloping, but these are fairly gentle slopes. They're easily cultivated. So really, you know, at the time of the enclosures, an awful lot of this grassland would have been brought under the plough. And you know, even, you know, in the late 19th century, botanists were recognizing that very little semi-natural magnesian limestone grassland was lost. It's an important habitat. Magnesian limestone grassland has it has the same broad communities as the grassland on the chalk on the Yorkshire Wolds, for instance, or grassland, some of the grassland on the mountain limestones in the Dales. But magnesian limestone tends to support a more southerly flora, and that applies to the kind of like the mosses as well as the flowering plants. So we really have incredibly little left of this habitat in Yorkshire now. So 6 of our 14 lost grassland species were from limestone habitats. 3 were from acid grassland, and these are plants that now grow mainly in the uplands. So we've got, you know, might seem bizarre now, but records of mountain everlasting from Copgrove and mountain pansy from Kirby Hill near Boroughbridge. We've also lost matgrass, you know, a plant that's incredibly common in the Pennines, covers vast areas of upland grassland in the the North Pennines, but it's disappeared entirely from the Central Vale. And we've got another 5 species that have been lost from meadows and pastures on clay and loamy soils. And some of these were actually relatively common in the past. So we've got over 14 locations for meadow saffron and at least 9 locations for green-winged orchid. Some of the other orchids like burnt orchid and frog orchid are also quite widespread. Generally speaking, if we look at the grassland plants that we've lost, again, these are plants of low nutrient habitats. So we've got an N value of 2.7. So that's on a scale of 1 to 9 there. So these are plants that are towards the lower end of the scale. So what that tells us is the plants that are most vulnerable to extinction have been the plants that can't cope with more competition for more vigorous species that occurs where fertility increases. So these are plants that have been particularly vulnerable to the application of fertilizer to grasslands. The woodland species that we've lost are rather kind of like mixed bunch. Some of these may well await rediscovery. I'm conscious that there's a quirk of the boundaries of the study area that it doesn't include the woodlands of the Skell Valley around Fountains Abbey and so on, where there are lots of rare woodland plants still occur. So it's not a particularly wooded area. It does include very rich woodlands in the Ure Gorge upstream of Tanfield. So Hackfall and Magdalen Woods there that still have lots of interesting species, and it may well be that a few of these plants are awaiting rediscovery there. 3 of these plants, so mountain melic, stone bramble and baneberry, very much associated with rocky limestone woodlands, so quite a specialised habitat. A couple of the other plants, yellow bird's nest and intermediate wintergreen, were actually they used to grow in fir plantations. So it's a rather sort of like mixed group that I don't think it tells us a huge amount about landscape change in the area. The other thing to say about woodland plants is because the plants we've lost are mostly quite specialised. This doesn't mean that just planting woodland is going to bring these plants back, because it's very unlikely you would be recreating the particular conditions that these plants need. So ruderal habitats, these are plants of kind of like waste ground, disturbed ground around villages, and I think it's quite a small group, 6 species, and it probably just reflects the fact that we have a tidier landscape now. So in contrast to a lot of the plants I've been talking about in wetlands, aquatic habitats in grassland, these are plants that actually like really fertile soils. And they used to grow in places like dung heaps and middens around villages, you know, in the time when you had a lot of horse muck and so on the roads, and it would be shuffled up into a midden in the village and so on. So a whole group of goosefoots that used to you know, thrive in those conditions, and some of them, you know, 1 or 2 of the species are now, I think upright goosefoot is now classified as critically endangered in Britain. Once probably grew in, like, you know, dung heaps in every village in England. Another interesting plant, henbane, which is the illustration here from an old herbal, and that grew in at least 11 locations that we know of, and that, although it's very poisonous, it's one of these toxic plants that, you know, used in at the right dose is quite valuable as a medicinal herb. So clearly that was widely cultivated and then used to grow in at least a semi-wild condition around villages. So that's a quite interesting group of plants that have disappeared. Another one was houseleek. I mean, houseleek used to grow very commonly. There are descriptions of how vigorous the houseleeks used to grow on thatched roofs in Snape, for example, in the 1780s. So again, you know, thatched roofs are a feature that's we don't think of as a habitat, but it is, and obviously that has almost disappeared. Heathland plants. This was a rather difficult category because there were extensive areas of heathland in the Swale and Ure Washlands. If you take Hutton Moor, which is the kind of escarpment just on the west side of the A1, north of Ripon, that was a really big area, something like 550 hectares of common land there, which once served several neighbouring villages. This must have been an amazing habitat, extensive areas of sheep grazed heather. There were a number of shepherds employed by different villages to look after the flocks on Hutton Moor. So this was a real kind of like landscape scale habitat, and you get descriptions of it as heathery moorland, lowland moorland, from the early 19th century. But then, as soon as that was enclosed, it was quite rapidly converted, predominantly to arable land with some conifer plantations as well. And then on the east side of the Swale, you've got a broad arc of sandy soils that extends from kind of like Easingwold and Raskelf almost up to Topcliffe there. So Pilmore is the last sort of like little remnant of that. But in fact, that was part of a much wider heathland landscape, some of which formed part of the Royal Forest of Galtres historically. So you can define heathland in different ways. Some of the plants of open habitats that I've mentioned were plants that grew in heathland landscapes, but strictly speaking, we've only lost three heathland plants: bell heather, bilberry, and petty whin. Of course, two of those are common enough in the uplands, but they have disappeared from this sort of central vale of North Yorkshire. And as you would expect, these are plants that are associated with very poor, very acidic soils. So just to reiterate a point that I've made repeatedly there, if you look at which plants have become extinct, if you look at the scatter diagram on the right, you can see the nutrient scale. A lot of plants that are around about, with a score around about 2, have disappeared, and very few that are higher up the scale. This isn't quite as clear cut as it might be, because around the middle you've got a lot of those arable plants that like soils of moderate fertility. So you've got a bit of a spike there around about 5. So it's not a simple diagram, but it does show that the burden of extinction, or the likelihood that species will go extinct in the local area, increases in inverse proportion to the soil nutrient levels. That's probably a rather garbled way of explaining it, but plants that need low nutrient soils have been most vulnerable to extinction. That's what this is telling us. There's also a direct loss of habitat. As I mentioned earlier, we've entirely lost lowland raised mires and the kind of like the sphagnum bog habitat that goes with those. No realistic prospect of recreating that. And we've almost entirely lost lowland dry heath. So a little bit of wet heath left at Pilmore, but Pilmore the remains of it is now very largely wooded. We've also lost those kind of like nutrient poor fen habitats. But we've got this all-pervasive eutrophication, nutrient enrichment of the wider landscape. Obviously, if you look at what we've got now, we've got the A1 corridor and lots of other traffic corridors with huge amounts of traffic day in, day out, even now in the middle of lockdown. Traffic produces large amounts of nitrogen oxides, which go into the atmosphere and effectively, act as a fertilizer. You've got lots of kind of like poultry units, haven't you? Lots of these big turkey sheds and so on the old airfields. They're producing ammonia, which also, acts as a fertilizer from the air. So if you look at, deposition rates for air pollution, you probably got something. It'll be around about 25 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year, just from pollution everywhere in the washlands. So you're getting a light top dressing of nitrogen fertilizer, whether you like it or not. And obviously that's one of the factors that drives the the disappearance of a lot of these smaller and less competitive plants, and that's echoed in lots of other national studies like the Countryside Survey, showing the same thing. So sandy road verges that might have had short patchy vegetation 100 years ago now often be like coarse grasses like cocksfoot and false oat, and big competitive plants like hogweed and stinging nettle and so on. And that's a situation that's sort of very difficult to reverse. So when we look at conservation strategies and when we look at restoring or recreating habitats, we've got to be realistic about the constraints. We're doing a lot of work at Nosterfield on restoring wetland habitats or recreating wetland habitats and certain types of fen. Even there, we've probably got more nutrient-rich waters than would be ideal, more nutrient-rich than they would have been historically. But that's just something. It's not something we can control really. So there are lots of constraints on what we do. I think that brings me to the end of what I've got to say. Thank you.
Martin, thank you. Joe, Claire, have you been collating questions?
We have, yeah. Thanks very much. Thanks. That was amazing, Martin. There's so much information there. It's fantastic. And so I am going to pose these questions to you just to let everybody know I am not a botanist, so they will be they'll be put across quite simply, and hopefully you'll be able to help us out, Martin and Simon, with some of the questions. So the first question we've got is from Suzanne, and she asks whether all the soil types mentioned occur on the River Ure floodplains. Nice one.
Yeah, so
nice one to kick you off.
I probably should explain this idea of the washlands is to do with the area that was kind of subject to the great deluges of material washed down from the northern Yorkshire Dales at the end of the last ice age. So this is where these really important deposits of sand and gravel that are quarried come from. It doesn't mean that it's all present day floodplain. A lot of it isn't. So the sandy soils, the limestone is obviously associated with the magnesian limestone ridge, which is mostly off the floodplain, although it does come onto the floodplain as well. The sandy soils, so I mentioned about Hutton Moor and Pillmore, they're what you call blown sands. So that was sand that was redistributed in the early post-glacial period. And they don't particularly extend onto the Ure floodplain, I don't think, no.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
I don't know if that answers the question.
That's great, thank you. So the next one is from Fiona. She's got an interesting question about non-native invasive species, which are a big problem, just below the confluence of the rivers Ure and Swale. And Fiona wants to know how the invasion of giant hogweed and Himalayan balsam is affecting the current habitat, and what do we know anything about what's been done to control them?
No, I mean, you'd have to talk to the Rivers Trust about what's going on with the control program. I mean, clearly non-native species are an issue, but when you look in a historical perspective, when you look at the the changes that have taken place in the local flora over the past 200 years, invasive species aren't a driver of plant extinctions. That's not to sort of like downplay the problems they cause, but it's nutrients and it's habitat loss that are the overwhelming drivers.
They're the biggies. Okay, we've got another question now from Dan, and he's wondering whether there's been any analysis of seed banks from the region, and are there any that are actually still intact?
I mean, the answer, as far as I know, no, but there are a couple of interesting points about that. So thinking about the arable plants, do you think, well, there's lots and lots of disturbed ground on quarries, and there have been one or two records. So, for instance, there's a plant that's not in that list of locally extinct species, but probably will be in 5 years' time, called night flowering catchfly. I mean, there's 20 or 30 historic records of that. It was a common plant of cornfields on the limestone, and there have been 2 records. I think of Simon's of like 1 or 2 plants around Nosterfield on quarried sites, but it's quite remarkable how little regenerates from the kind of the quarry spoil. So it does suggest that the seed banks are quite limited. Some of the other arable plants like burr parsley, the odd plant crops up now and again, but I suspect that seed bank is rapidly diminishing.
Okay. I love the way these questions are all in a really random order. So here's something completely different from the Morgans, who found a cornflower in an arable field in Morton-on-Swale last year.
Oh.
And they think that field's been alternated between pasture and crops. So they're wondering, would that have just been a garden escape? Do you think?
I think it's really hard to tell. If it's sort of like in the middle of a field, you suspect it probably is from the soil seed bank.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the problems is that you get so much, often done with the best of intentions, but there is so much kind of like random sowing of wildflower seed now, often completely undocumented. There's no record of it. It's often sort of quite incongruous mixtures of plants, sometimes not really native plants, sown in really inappropriate places. And it really confuses our understanding of how the environment is changing.
Yeah. With things popping up that you're not expecting in strange places. Or okay, thanks for that. Another question.
I'll just add very quickly.
Yeah, go for it.
There are occasions when under countryside stewardship schemes, species like that and corncockle and so on have been introduced. Indeed, just down the road from where I am here at Blows Hall at Coptuick, there's a spectacular sort of show of corncockle and so on up there sown, and it really does look amazing. But I can assure you the fact that it wouldn't have been there naturally if it hadn't been so.
But as you say, probably a part of a stewardship agreement. Yeah. Thanks for that, Simon. So we've got another question from Dan, who's asking, how do localised plant extinction rates compare to wider regions or national rates? So are there species becoming nationally extinct or still clinging on in now isolated pockets? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it kind of, now I mean there have been lots of regional studies. The problem is it's actually sort of quite complicated how you do the statistics on this, because really, just talking about there being 24 arable plants, but it's 24 arable plants out of how many and so on. And all that becomes quite difficult to calibrate, and probably well beyond my very primitive sort of like understanding of statistics. So I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. However, a large portion of the species that we've lost locally are threatened nationally. That does vary quite considerably between groups. It also depends on what you regard as a national context. So in some groups, there's far more species are threatened in England than they are in Great Britain. So for instance, with fen plants, quite a lot of those are doing okay in Scotland, because they've got a lot more clean water and a lot less stress on wetland habitats there than we have in England. If you were to then sort of drill down to the arable lowlands of eastern England, a lot of those plants are really seriously in danger. So I think generally it does follow national trends. Some of the species we've lost, like sundews, for instance, they're insect-eating plants of really low nutrient mire habitats, and they've gone from most of lowland England, and that probably applies to Hampshire or Shropshire as well as North Yorkshire. Yeah,
thanks for that. I hope that answers your question, Dan. Next one is from Pan. She's asking whether we should be concentrating on preserving remnant wetland habitats.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I said with the if you take a site like Leckby Carr, that would be, it was only a little site. It's only like if you see it, it's just like a really small valley, in a few acres in extent. But that would now, if it survived intact, if it survived how, you know, botanists like Dalton found it in the, you know, the beginning of the 19th century, it would be considered to be of international conservation importance. I mean, that's no exaggeration. And now it's just gone. It's just a conifer plantation. There's nothing left there at all. So, you know, absolutely, yes. So the priority should be these bits of habitat that we've got left. We're interested in restoring and recreating habitat to expand those and recreate and recreate links between those areas. But the absolute priority is those little bits, those precious little fragments that we've got left. And there are a few, you know, and they're fantastic habitats. So that's definitely the priority.
Thank you for that. Another switching again. Keith is asking whether salt used on the roads in winter has had a major impact on verges. Does that make a big difference on the verges to the plants?
Yeah, road verges are yeah. I think road verges are a really interesting subject, and it's something that, I mean, I've got some questions that I haven't answered about that.
Right.
And I think the answer in brief is that it does have an effect in that you actually get, like, up the sides of the A1. If you drive up there in a month's time, you know, the edge of the central reservation will be white with Danish scurvy grass. That's a coastal plant, because of the salt. You get those distinct salt marsh communities, and, you know, even in sort of like small rural roads, you get things like reflex salt marsh grass growing because of the salting. Whether that has a big sort of like effects wider, I don't know. Road verges are interesting because there's a lot of interest in conserving road verges for wildflowers and the insects that depend on them. And we tend to think of road verges as meadows, as either like remnant meadows or potential meadows that could be managed as meadows. I'm not sure they necessarily were.
Right, yeah.
A lot of the plants that have disappeared from road verges are not meadow plants. They're plants that are more distinctly to do with boundaries and edges of other habitats. So it's something I'd like to understand more about. I don't have any answer to that.
Might be a subject for your next webinar. Here's one, and if you feel free to chip in, Simon. So Martin might not, or he could answer this one, but both of you might have a thought on this. Laura would like to know about any success stories across this region of plant reintroductions into the habitats that we've been talking about today. So we're after any success stories.
Well, I can open on that, and Martin can certainly enlarge. I think one of the things that we really noticed, and was so apparent from Martin's talk, was the loss of wetland plants. And you take plants such as great fen sedge, cladium, you're now down to sort of half a dozen sites left in Yorkshire, Yorkshire Wildlife Trust Reserve at Aston Bog. There are actually about sort of 3 within our area. And if you go right back into evidence from the Paleolithic evidence, let's say, it's very apparent from seed remains there that it was relatively abundant in our wetlands. So, you know, we're now talking very low numbers. Now, we collected local seed and we've reintroduced that at Mostfield. And we've been amazed at how successfully it gets away. And there's sort of some indication that perhaps it doesn't naturally regenerate that easily. So sometimes actually giving a species a helping hand can be very, very successful. But as Martin says, you know, there are a lot of the constraints we've got on us are increased nutrient levels. You know, could Shero Mires, for instance, turn round to become the reed fen that it was in the past? Well, it would probably struggle because of the nutrient load in there now, even though a number of those plants are still there. An awful lot of them have been lost. But there is enormous scope. And I think, dare I say, the minerals industry offer an opportunity to do that, because to an extent you're starting with lower nutrient levels with a lot of those soils, and that's a naturally good starting point. But we're up against that nutrient load that Martin referred to.
Yeah.
Martin, you I'm sure can add to that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of plant reintroductions, I mean, they can be very successful. I mean, I think if you understand the reason why a species have disappeared and you've addressed those causes, you know, you can reintroduce species very successfully. I mean, the Northwest Rare Plants Initiative has had real success there in you know, reintroducing species that have been lost from you know, lowland bog sites there in the Northwest. Those sites have been restored and rehabilitated successfully. Their hydrology has been restored, and then, you know, you can go and put those plants back. And Joshua over there is a fantastic results from that. We're not quite at that stage yet, but we are, you know, we are propagating some of these species that I've mentioned on a large scale at Nosterfield, something we always need volunteers to help with.
Hint, hint, everybody, 84 participants on the call.
So,
get in touch.
Yeah, and, you know, certainly some of those species that I mean, we found with the wetland plants that they don't come back naturally. So we would always favour natural regeneration. You know, in the first instance, you know, letting nature do its thing is often, you know, by far the best course. But with the wetland plants, they just don't come back. They don't get there. There's no seed bank locally, or they're just so poor, you know, that they're adapted for dispersing, for seeds floating on water, so they're never going to get there naturally. And we have found, you know, some things. I mean, Cladium, you know, once it's grown and established, is probably the best performing plant we've got on the site. So we will be looking. I mean, tufted loosestrife that I mentioned, the only native site in England for that remaining is Gormire Lake near Thirsk, which is outside our area but reasonably local. And we are looking at reintroducing that to the washlands from local seed sources and so on. We just started with some of the other habitats. We're trying to grow tower mustard. That's a nationally endangered plant. It used to grow very commonly up the A1 corridor. The last record was from 1989. We've actually just started a project growing that, and we're growing plenty of it. And that's one of these species of kind of like sandy waysides and hedge banks and so on. So, you know, hopefully we can re-establish a population of that at Nosterfield.
Yeah. Thanks for that. That sort of leads on to the.
I'm just going to come in quickly, Joe, if I may, on that.
Yeah.
As Martin says, natural regeneration is something we've always been deeply passionate about. And the huge range of species that we've got on the reserve at Nosterfield, I mean, in excess of 300 species, 9 species of orchids, have all come in naturally. The key thing is, though, as Martin says, some species are simply not going to get there naturally. And if you can see that that is where the community wants to move in that direction, assisting it by reintroducing it, if you like, is a real positive. I would, though, make a huge plea here that these things can cause a lot of confusion. And I think sort of colleagues in BSBI would probably be screaming at some of these comments about reintroductions. It's absolutely essential that if something is going to be introduced, it should be done with real integrity. It should be properly noted. The local recorder's informed about it. Otherwise, we don't really have a clear picture of what is going on. But, you know, in the case particularly of wetland species, it's really necessary for us to do that in order to help recreate the habitats, because it helps a huge range of vertebrates and so on as well by doing that. I hope that's helpful.
That's great, thank you. It sort of leads on well to, well, you've kind of covered some of this, but I'll just read an interesting comment from Jono. It sort of started a bigger conversation by asking whether there are any places that have got a realistic chance of bringing lost species back, or at least halting the decline. So we've talked a bit about that. He says, we know this is happening at Nosterfield and some Yorkshire Wildlife Trust reserves and possibly others. Here's the interesting bit. Could there maybe be a target list of species and list of sites and a strategy to do this as a cooperative? So I guess it's the kind of, you know, the suggestion of bringing it together across.
I'll come in there very quickly, and again, I'm sure Martin will enlarge on that. To a very high degree, one of the things when we set the Swale and Ure Washlands project up, it was to actually form a strategy for minerals after use. And we recognise that particularly sort of narrow, shallow lakes and more nutrient poor soils and so on had enormous scope for nature conservation value. Equally, if it's a very deep lake, it may be more appropriate for another use, such as sailing. And so taking a strategic approach was absolutely central to what we were doing. And I think Martin's work here, we felt from day one, was incredibly valuable to build a picture of habitats that could be recreated, particularly on those mineral sites. So yeah, let's sort of hope this forms a basis, and with the new environmental land management scheme, or ELMS scheme, coming in from the government, hopefully this will sort of lead to recreation of more interesting habitats, or let's say restoration, rather better.
Yeah,
Martin.
Yeah, I completely, endorse John's comment. Actually, yeah, scale is really important. I mean, sometimes with plants, you can look at either maintaining existing populations or reintroducing them, almost in a gardening approach, almost a horticultural approach to doing that. That's just not sustainable, is it? The whole aim should be that these things should have healthy, widespread, self-sustaining populations, and you often can't do that on a single site basis. Even with these kind of open habitats that I've talked about, they're very dynamic habitats. The conditions on one given site may change and become unfavorable for a while. So it's like anything else. It's meta populations. It's the ability for populations to wax and wane naturally, for things to colonize new sites as they disappear from old ones. All that kind of thing is crucially important.
Yeah.
So I think the answer is yes.
Thank you, Matt.
We
I've got a
need
couple
networks of habitats. Yeah.
Sorry, thanks. Couple more questions, and then we've probably time to wrap up. People's tummies will be rumbling probably. So we've got one from Mike. He's asking for Martin and Simon's opinion on planting new meadows. Well, you've sort of just touched on this: new meadows in reserves and increasingly in domestic gardens or privately owned land.
Well, I mean, if I can jump, I mean, Simon will have something to say about this as well. I mean, what you do in your garden is fine. You can do whatever, and it's great if people do sow plants to encourage wildlife. I would say in the wider countryside, something that concerns me is that some work that's done under the banner of conservation, I think, isn't conserving biodiversity. It's actually homogenizing the countryside. So I know of government organisations that sow the same seed mix from Cornwall to Northumberland, literally. And if you drive along the motorway network, you will see the Highways England Oxide Daisy Meadow, the length and breadth of the country. Yeah. I don't see that as conservation, because it's not it's not conserving diversity, is it? No. It might provide some benefits for insects, great. But it doesn't sort of like reflect the varying character of the countryside, which is what I think conservation should be all about. So I've done a lot of work on grassland recreation. It can be very successful, although it's terribly hard work. But I would say, try and use local resources, finding the species-rich grassland on your local nature reserve. I mean, we've got a site that we're looking to use at Sharrow Churchyard, where Simon is. That's using the hay from sites like that to reseed sites where the plants are missing. There are all sorts of opportunities like that, but make use of of your local flora to create these new grasslands, rather than using something that's bought in a seed packet that if you're lucky, will be of British provenance, but even then likely to come from the other end of the country. I saw a large habitat recreation project further north in England not long ago, in an area that's of international importance for its upland meadows. And it was being sown, you know, acre after acre had been sown with a seed mix that's really designed for the South Downs. And it just seemed incredibly incongruous. I just thought, this is just such a wasted opportunity. So I would encourage people to always think about what's most appropriate to the locality and what your local genetic resources are.
Yeah. Anything to add on that, Simon, before I go to the last question?
No, I would absolutely concur with that. I would add you know, mention of Share a Churchyard. 30 years ago, a couple of us crawled around on our hands and knees and found a nice range of species, and managed to talk the churchyard in the church into managing it as a hay meadow, or part of it as a hay meadow. And it really is now fantastic. You know, a few hundred spikes of common spotted orchids and so on, and it's just a joy to go to. But I think it really becomes so much more valuable in the eyes of the local community when they see us managing it sympathetically and collecting seed to create more meadows. It makes them realise how valuable it is. So it's all part of a sort of pattern that builds up by raising the profile of the sites that have native local provenance.
Yeah. Last question then, and then I'll pass back to you to wrap up, Simon. Changing subject again. Rita asks whether climate change could be an opportunity as well as a threat. Could increasing rainfall and flooding help to naturally recreate wetlands or recreate wetlands?
Yes, depending how we deal with it.
Sorry, there's a nice big question with a couple of minutes left.
It is quite a big question. I would say I was thinking that changes in the local flora, you might be able to see climate change having an effect, but vegetation is a lot more sticky than, say, insects. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt, you know, anyone who's involved in insect recording will tell you that there are huge and often very rapid changes that are going on that are clearly driven by climate. And overwhelmingly, this involves mobile species of a southerly distribution moving north. And where we are, you know, in North Yorkshire, we're right on the kind of like the natural cusp between the southern and eastern lowlands and the northern and western parts of Britain. So we see that change. It's very obvious to us. You know, with the water bugs that I study, you know, you can almost see it in real time, these southern species marching northwards. You haven't particularly seen that with the flora, or not as obviously anyway.
Yeah, I mean, if I just sort of come in there quickly, I think Sir John Lawton's work saying bigger and better, as we've already implied there, landscape scale is absolutely crucial to this, and creating sort of corridors and stepping stones for species to move. You know, as mentioned with something like rannoch rush, their isolation within the country meant the chances of them naturally, even with climate change that might be more suitable, probably particularly not in rannoch rush, which is more of a northerly species, but without the opportunity for the seed to spread, that isn't going to happen, and that particularly applies with wetland species. Some other invertebrates and things like dragonflies have been staggeringly successful at moving. They've got wings, they can move. Plants can't so readily do that. Others, you can actually see them moving up the A1 because they pick up on vehicles and move. And so it's absolutely, Sir John Lawton was on the nail when he said, we've got to look at this on a big, grand scale. Yeah.
Thank you very much, both of you, for tackling all those questions. There's such a massive range, and thanks everybody for posing them and adding some extra interest on the back of Martin's fantastic presentation. I'll pass back to you, Simon, to just wrap up and say cheerio to everyone.
Good. Well, no, thank you very much indeed, everyone, for coming and joining us today. And a massive thanks to Martin. He's been a very good friend to our charity for over 20 years. And I think his knowledge and his passion absolutely shines through. But also, you know, thank you to everyone else who's been supporting us. Heritage Lottery Fund very kindly supported financially with the lottery, with our webinar. Also, you know, a massive thank you to North and East Yorkshire Ecological Data Centre, who have been steering Martin and I through the complexities of life and the webinars. Thank you so much to both of you. Also, as I mentioned earlier on, thank you to Yorkshire Wildlife Trust for their support with funding from the Environment Agency. You know, all of these things pull together. This is partnership. This is how these things can work really well. And last but not least, a huge thank you to BSBI, Botanical Society of the British Isles, for all the work that they have done, not least of all in collating the data. And again, I would make the plea, please, if you are going to consider an introduction, do deal with it with great integrity and inform people and have a proper protocol. So thank you once again for joining us. And hopefully we'll be having another webinar before too long. All the best. Bye for now.